am 32 years old. I live in Denver, and this morning, I woke up to 29 missed calls from an Illinois area code. I sat at my kitchen counter and watched the screen flash, letting my coffee go completely cold in my hand. Before I even checked the voicemails, I knew exactly who was trying to reach me. When you spend 20 years running away from the people who raised you, you learn to memorize the specific dread that comes from a ringing phone. Growing up in Willow Creek, Illinois, my childhood was dictated by a single, unspoken rule regarding our family image. My parents, Brenda and Richard Vance, ran a highly successful chain of local home goods stores, which meant our public life had to look like a glossy catalog cover. They waved at neighbors, donated to local charities, and played the roles of upstanding community pillars with terrifying perfection. But behind our front door, affection was completely conditional, and my daily safety was always subject to my mother's crushing boredom. Brenda loved to invent what she called life lessons to toughen me up for the real world. If I showed any normal childhood vulnerability, like asking for help with a difficult task or crying over a scraped knee, she saw it as a severe character flaw that needed immediate correction. My father never stopped her. Instead, he treated my distress like a spectator sport, grinning from the sidelines and occasionally placing bets on how long it would take me to break. Once, when I was 8, I asked for a new pair of sneakers at the mall because my soles were physically detaching from the shoes. My mother told me I was acting entitled, forced me to sit on a bench near the food court, and left me there entirely alone for 3 hours to teach me that society owed me absolutely nothing. They returned with fresh pretzels and shopping bags, laughing because my father had just won $20, betting I would still be sitting in the exact same spot. 2 years later, they pulled a similar stunt when a group of older boys humiliated me in the parking lot after a youth soccer game. Instead of offering comfort on the ride back, my parents pulled into a deserted section of the stadium lot, ordered me out of the car, and drove away into the dark. I sat on a concrete curb for nearly an hour, watching their taillights vanish, learning very quickly that showing any sign of weakness only guaranteed a harsher punishment from the people who were supposed to protect me. Their behavior was never framed as cruelty, which made it infinitely harder to process as a child just trying to make sense of her environment. They used words like resilience and grit, convincing themselves that they were performing a noble duty by hardening me against a dangerous society. I adapted by making myself as invisible as possible, memorizing the weight of my mother's footsteps and the exact tone of my father's laugh, so I could predict their daily moods. I learned to stay perfectly quiet, to never ask for favors, and to simply fade into the background of our house, in hopes of avoiding their constant psychological experiments. My only real escape during those years was drawing on the backs of store receipts and cheap sketch pads, creating quiet, empty rooms on paper where nobody could suddenly change the rules. That small piece of joy became the catalyst for the worst day of my life, when I proudly brought home a B+ in my middle school art class. I thought they might finally be happy with my effort, but my mother held the report card like I had just committed a massive betrayal. She demanded to know how someone who wasted so much time doodling could still manage to be a disappointment in her absolute favorite subject. My father chimed in from the kitchen, casually suggesting I was getting lazy and needed a severe reality check to snap me out of my daydreams. Later that night, I sat at my desk listening to their low, amused voices drift down the hallway, perfectly aware that they were planning something at my expense. My mother told my father I required a lesson that would permanently alter my perspective, and he eagerly agreed, promising to put cash on the outcome. The next morning, the suffocating tension in the house was suddenly replaced by a cheerful, sickeningly sweet energy that made my stomach tie itself into knots. They announced we were taking a spontaneous family day trip into downtown Chicago, smiling at me with bright, vacant eyes that told me the trap had already been set. The entire drive into the city felt wrong in a way my 12-year-old brain could not fully articulate, but my nervous system completely understood. My father kept the radio volume high and drummed his fingers on the steering wheel like a man heading to a victory party. From the passenger seat, my mother kept turning around to interrogate me with questions she already knew I would have to answer carefully. She asked if I thought I was exceptionally smart, and if I believed smart girls were genuinely prepared for the harsh realities of the actual world. Every cautious answer I gave only seemed to amuse them more, and every time I tried to retreat into silence, they pushed harder. By the time the massive Chicago skyline came into view, my body was humming with that familiar, sickening dread that warned me a punishment was coming, and I would not be allowed to brace for it. We finally parked near Union Station around noon, and the sheer scale of the place immediately overwhelmed me. I had never seen a building so massive or a crowd so densely packed, with businessmen, tourists, and college students rushing in every possible direction. Inside the main hall, my mother pointed her finger at a colossal stone pillar near the entrance and instructed me to wait exactly on that spot while they moved the car and grabbed a quick lunch. She told me it would take 15 minutes, maybe 20 at the absolute most. When I quietly asked if I could just go with them, my father laughed so loudly that several people walking past actually turned to stare at us. My mother leaned in close, warned me not to embarrass her in a public space, and walked away with my father trailing right behind her. I stood frozen against that stone pillar and started obsessively checking the giant station clock hanging overhead. 15 minutes stretched into 30, then 45, while I desperately tried to convince myself that city parking was just difficult, or the food lines were incredibly long. As the clock crossed the 1-hour mark, a sharp, physical panic started rising in my chest and making my hands shake uncontrollably. I had exactly $9 in my pocket, no cellular phone, no written address, and absolutely no understanding of how the transit system worked. I started taking a few steps away from the pillar to look for them, only to rush frantically back because I was still deeply terrified of violating their rules. Every new announcement over the loudspeaker made my heart violently jump, and every passing woman with dark hair made me snap my head around in desperate hope. Then I saw our familiar car moving slowly past the large glass windows facing the busy street outside. A massive wave of relief crashed through my entire body, hitting me so hard I actually let out a shaky breath of laughter. I ran straight toward the glass, waving both of my arms frantically, genuinely believing for one split second that they had simply gotten turned around in traffic and were finally coming back to get me. My father was behind the wheel, my mother was in the passenger seat, and both of them had their heads turned to look directly at me. My father broke into a massive smile, but it was not the relieved expression of a parent locating a lost child in a crowded city. It was the deeply satisfied smirk of a man watching his favorite punchline land exactly the way he had meticulously planned. My mother casually rolled down her window, leaning out just far enough so her voice would carry over the heavy street traffic. She yelled that she had bet $50 I could not find my own way home, and then she threw her head back and laughed. My father laughed right along with her, lifting one hand off the steering wheel to give me a mocking thumbs up, as if they were congratulating themselves on a brilliant performance. Then the car seamlessly merged back into the flow of traffic and disappeared completely from my sight. That was the exact moment the entire shape of the world fundamentally shifted for me. It was one thing to constantly fear they might accidentally forget me, but it was an entirely different reality to watch them actively choose my terror and thoroughly enjoy it. The paralyzing realization hit me that my crushing fear was never an unfortunate side effect of their parenting strategy, but rather the entire point of the game. I stood frozen against the glass until a man holding a briefcase brushed past my shoulder and muttered a quick apology. The sudden sound of a stranger's voice snapped me violently back into my own body, forcing me to realize I was entirely alone in a city of nearly 3 million people. I wandered blindly from one end of the massive station to the other, crying intermittently and aggressively scrubbing my face because my parents had thoroughly trained me to be ashamed of my own tears. I desperately tried to think of a single person I could call for help, but there was absolutely no one, and attempting to picture the route back to Willow Creek felt like trying to map a path to another planet. At some point during those long hours, the agonizing waiting officially ended, and the quiet, crushing reality of total abandonment finally began. I spent nearly 3 hours trapped inside Union Station after they drove away, which was more than enough time for the harsh afternoon sunlight to begin shifting into long shadows. I deliberately stayed away from the heavy exit doors because I was terrified of stepping out into the chaotic city grid and getting even more hopelessly lost. I also actively avoided the station police, having been taught for years that causing any sort of public trouble meant authority figures would only make the situation worse. I even kept my distance from friendly-looking strangers, because the very people who had just abandoned me had spent my entire life insisting that asking anyone for help was a disgusting display of weakness. Looking back now, the cruelest part of their twisted game was how they had systematically trained me not to trust a single person, and then intentionally dumped me in a place where asking for help was my only actual lifeline. The person who finally broke through my invisible wall was a transit worker named Gloria, a woman in her 50s with incredibly tired eyes and a naturally calming voice. She had apparently watched me pace past the exact same row of vending machines multiple times, and she finally stopped me near a quiet hallway leading toward the administrative offices to ask if I was lost. I immediately fell back on my training and lied to her face, insisting quietly that I was just waiting for my parents to come back from lunch. She asked me how long I had been waiting there, and when I told her I did not know, she gently asked if I had eaten anything that day. That simple, mundane question shattered whatever fragile armor I had left, and I started sobbing so violently that I could barely draw oxygen into my lungs. All the heavy, toxic shame I had been swallowing for hours came pouring out in one ugly rush, and I told her about the bet, the laughter through the car window, and the thumbs up my father had given me before driving away. Gloria did not tell me to calm down, and she certainly did not accuse me of being overly dramatic, the way my own family always did. She simply crouched down so we were at eye level, and told me in a firm, steady voice that I was completely safe, and she was going to handle everything. Within minutes, station security arrived, followed closely by transit police, who immediately pulled the exterior camera footage and confirmed my parents' car had indeed slowed by the curb before accelerating away. When the lead officer finally reached my parents by phone, I watched his expression shift from cautious professionalism to absolute, unvarnished disgust in a matter of seconds. He listened to whatever justification my mother was offering before cutting her off completely, stating flatly that leaving a 12-year-old child alone in a major transit hub was not a parenting lesson, but a criminal act of child abandonment. By early evening, I found myself sitting in a sterile interview room with a social worker who gently explained that because my parents were adamantly refusing to return to Chicago immediately, I was being placed in emergency foster care. I was absolutely terrified of what that meant, until I arrived at the home of David and Sarah Harper, a quiet photographer and a grounded preschool teacher who completely ignored the rigid rules I was used to following. Their house was cluttered, warm, and smelled faintly of classroom paper, offering a lived-in comfort that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, museum-like perfection of my childhood home. Sarah casually asked if I preferred soup or spaghetti for dinner, and David quietly asked if I wanted the hallway light left on or off, with neither of them demanding any sort of gratitude for simply keeping me alive. Lying in their guest bed that first night, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, I realized the total stranger at a train station had shown me more genuine humanity in 5 minutes than my own mother had managed in 12 years. The days following that night felt like walking through someone else's life entirely. I was shuffled from the Harper's quiet house to sterile meeting rooms with social workers, then to psychological evaluations, and eventually into a massive downtown family court building. The adults around me spoke in hushed, careful tones about my future, treating my situation like it was both incredibly fragile and urgently important. My parents eventually arrived for the initial hearing, flanking an expensive-looking lawyer and carrying the exact same arrogant attitude they had always displayed in our living room. My mother wore a sharply pressed navy blazer and pearl earrings, operating under the delusion that looking wealthy and respectable would magically erase the fact that she had abandoned her child. My father simply leaned back in his chair, with his arms tightly crossed, projecting the bored annoyance of a man enduring a minor inconvenience he fully expected to outlast. The most unbelievable part of the entire hearing was that my parents never actually denied leaving me alone at Union Station. They openly admitted to the timeline and the location, but they stubbornly insisted to the judge that their actions were a perfectly calculated, educational necessity. My mother sat under oath and confidently claimed they were simply trying to build resilience in a daughter who lacked basic survival skills. My father chimed in right behind her, arguing that children in this country had become entirely too soft and someone needed to take the initiative to teach them how the real world operated. I sat directly across from them, listening to them legally justify my terror, and realized they were completely incapable of understanding the damage they had caused. If they possessed even an ounce of self-awareness or genuine remorse, they would have turned their car around before they ever reached the highway that afternoon. The turning point came when the court-appointed therapist submitted a comprehensive report detailing my home life. The document outlined a severe, long-term pattern of emotional abuse, systemic humiliation, calculated neglect, and escalating endangerment that culminated in the train station incident. Hearing those clinical terms read out loud in a courtroom felt like clean oxygen finally entering a room where I had been suffocating for a decade. For years, I had quietly convinced myself that my miserable childhood was somehow my own fault, because blaming myself was far easier than accepting that my parents were intentionally choosing to hurt me. The official report made it undeniably plain to everyone in the room that my upbringing was not just a strict parenting style or a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. It was systematic, deliberate abuse dressed up in comfortable middle-class language to avoid neighborhood suspicion. When the judge leaned forward and asked if I had any desire to return home while the court monitored my family, I said no so quickly that the speed of my own answer actually shocked me. My mother stared at me as if I had physically struck her across the face, while my father aggressively muttered something under his breath about my complete lack of gratitude for everything they had provided. The judge remained entirely unfazed by their performance and outlined a standard path toward reunification, involving mandatory parenting classes, intensive family therapy, supervised visits, and strict state oversight to ensure my ongoing safety. My parents visibly recoiled at the very idea of social workers and court officers having direct, unfiltered access to the private family dynamics they had spent years meticulously hiding from the public. My father complained bitterly to his lawyer about the potential damage to his business reputation, while my mother loudly declared she would never allow the government to dictate how she ran her own household. They were then given a stark, final choice: commit to a strict 2-year reunification program to earn me back, or voluntarily surrender their parental rights and walk away. They chose to surrender their rights right there on the spot, handing me over to the state simply because protecting their fragile pride was vastly more important than keeping their daughter. After the courtroom, things moved quickly. David and Sarah were already licensed foster parents, and over the following months, they quietly transitioned into my actual family. When the adoption paperwork was finally being prepared, and the judge asked if I wanted to change my name, I did not hesitate for a single second. Madison Vance was a terrified 12-year-old who stood in a massive train station with $9 in her pocket, waiting for parents who were never coming back. Chloe Harper was someone entirely new, someone who had a bedroom with a door that stayed closed, a desk covered in drawing supplies, and a family that never treated her fear as a punchline. The first night the adoption became official, Sarah simply put fresh sheets on my bed like any normal Sunday, proving to me that real love does not demand a spectacular performance to prove you deserve it. Healing from that kind of psychological damage did not happen all at once, and it certainly did not look like a neat montage in a movie. For years, my nervous system continued to treat basic kindness like a carefully laid trap just waiting to spring shut. If Sarah ran to the grocery store and promised to return in 20 minutes, I had to physically restrain myself from pacing in front of the living room window until her car pulled into the driveway. If David was running late to pick me up from school because of unpredictable traffic, a cold panic would rise in my chest and make my hands completely numb. I spent years in therapy untangling the mess my biological parents left behind, learning the hard way that surviving constant emotional abuse does not make you stronger. It just makes you exceptionally good at predicting danger and terrible at resting. Through all of those difficult years, David and Sarah remained incredibly steady and never once tried to rush my recovery. They encouraged my art, which slowly transformed from a desperate escape mechanism into a concrete way to structure my world and speak without being interrupted. I poured every ounce of my energy into building a portfolio, eventually getting accepted into a rigorous design program back in Chicago, turning the very city that once terrified me into the place where I finally claimed my independence. After graduation, I moved out to Denver to take a job with a branding firm, putting 1,000 miles between myself and the state of Illinois to ensure geography was permanently on my side. Eventually, I opened my own independent design studio, focused on clean, honest visual storytelling, which always felt like a quiet victory over the elaborate lies my biological parents forced me to live inside. Denver gave me the massive physical and mental space I needed to build a life completely devoid of chaotic mind games. I met my husband Ryan through a mutual friend, and I was immediately drawn to his calm, level-headed nature that never required any sort of dramatic performance. When I finally told him the full story about Union Station on our 5th date, he did not offer me empty platitudes or try to convince me that everything happens for a reason. He simply reached across the table, held my hand, and told me in a steady voice that I never should have been put in that position by the people supposed to protect me. We built a beautiful, quiet life together, getting married in a small ceremony, adopting a cautious rescue dog named Max, and completely blocking every possible digital avenue the Vance family could ever use to contact me. For nearly 2 decades, that absolute blockade held firm, allowing me to go entire months without ever thinking about the people I left behind in Willow Creek. Then my phone lit up with 29 missed calls, followed by a voicemail, an email from an unknown address, and finally a direct message request on my professional LinkedIn profile. That specific escalation told me everything I needed to know, because someone had spent serious time and effort connecting the successful designer in Denver back to the abandoned girl in Illinois. I sat motionless at my kitchen counter, with my phone burning in my hand, feeling Max press his warm weight against my leg, while Ryan watched the color drain completely from my face. I had spent my entire adult life burying my toxic history under a mountain of carefully constructed peace, but the frantic messages on my screen proved the past had finally brought a shovel. The voicemail was not from my mother, but from my younger sister Emma, whose voice I had not heard since she was a toddler trailing behind me in the hallway. She sounded completely exhausted, carrying the heavy, rough tone of someone who had spent her entire life trying to survive our parents' crushing expectations and emotional games. Emma told me our mother had late-stage cancer, and our father had suffered a mild stroke about 6 months prior, leaving them both frail and largely housebound. She explained that the family stores were completely gone, sold off at massive losses after the dark history they tried so hard to bury finally caught up with them. The carefully curated Vance family image had shattered entirely because my mother, in a staggering display of public hypocrisy, left a Facebook comment criticizing someone else's parenting, while boasting about the necessity of strict discipline. That single arrogant comment blew the lid off 20 years of tightly held small-town secrets, when a retired court clerk recognized the names and dropped a heavy hint online. That tiny crack was all it took for former neighbors, old teachers, and disgruntled employees to flood the thread with their own horrific observations about my parents' true nature behind closed doors. The community of Willow Creek, which had once shielded them with polite gossip and middle-class respectability, completely turned on them and drained their remaining businesses of every last loyal customer. Emma told me they had lost the big house and were now living in a cheap, subsidized apartment outside of town, stripped of their wealth, their local standing, and the invisible armor of their reputation. She admitted she was only calling because they were desperate for me to come back, not because they had found sudden clarity or remorse, but because they were completely out of options and terrified of dying entirely alone. I asked Emma why she was facilitating this message if she knew exactly what they had done to me all those years ago. She paused for a long time before admitting she had recently cut all contact with them herself, after officially requesting the unsealed court documents to protect her own newborn son. Reading the clinical, undeniable truth about what happened at Union Station completely broke the watered-down lies our parents had fed her, making her realize she could never allow those monsters near her child. Hearing my little sister validate my reality should have felt like a massive triumph, but it just left me feeling a deep, exhausted sorrow for the family we never actually got the chance to have. The next morning, I booked a flight back to Chicago, making it explicitly clear to Ryan and my adoptive parents that I was not going back to save the people who broke me, but to finally close the door using my own voice. I drove straight from O'Hare to the suburban hospital where my mother was receiving treatment, walking into a sterile room that smelled faintly of bleach and stale panic. My father looked physically shrunken, sitting in the visitor chair, as if his public disgrace and failing health had finally stripped away the arrogant bully I remembered, leaving behind a remarkably small, pathetic man. My mother still tried to arrange her face into a mask of dignified suffering, instinctively performing for an audience, even while hooked up to monitors in a hospital bed. She immediately started crying, the loud theatrical kind of weeping, designed entirely to pull focus and force comfort, and reached out her hand while calling me Madison. I stood firmly at the foot of her bed with my arms crossed, looked her dead in the eye, and coldly corrected her to Chloe, ensuring she understood that the terrified girl she abandoned no longer existed. My father weakly attempted to intervene, muttering a pathetic apology about how they had made some unfortunate mistakes when they were younger and under a lot of business pressure. I cut him off immediately, keeping my voice dangerously quiet but completely steady as I explained that missing a highway exit or forgetting to buy groceries is a simple mistake. Deliberately driving a 12-year-old into the heart of Chicago, abandoning her in a massive transit station, laughing at her terror through a car window, and then surrendering parental rights to avoid public embarrassment was a calculated series of violent choices. I told them I did not travel across the country to offer them absolution, closure, or comfort in their final miserable days. I came to look them in the eye, verify that they had lost absolutely everything they once valued, and assure them that their absolute worst fear of dying alone was exactly what they had rightfully earned. Walking out of that hospital and stepping back into the freezing Illinois air was the first time in 20 years I truly felt the heavy weight of my childhood completely lift off my shoulders. I flew back to Denver that exact same night, returning to a quiet house, a fiercely loving husband, and a beautiful life I built entirely with my own two hands. You cannot control the toxic family you are born into, but you absolutely possess the power to decide who gets to walk into the future with you. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. And if this resonated with you, please hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. What do you think are the earliest warning signs of emotional manipulation in the family dynamic? Do you think true forgiveness is always necessary for personal peace? Or is walking away sometimes the healthiest choice? How do you begin to rebuild trust in others after the people supposed to protect you are the ones who cause the most harm?